The BS Report is a free-flowing conversation that occasionally touches on mature subjects.
First of all,
This is the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
it might be cool, I don't know. And if it's not, I don't
The
care.
BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Bill Simmons works for ESPN. He's also named the Sports Guy, and he writes a comical sports column. He must be a popular dude.
The BS Report.
It's got a real dirty sound, like a rusty steak knife cutting through a well-aged steak.
Now.
Here's Bill Simmons.
Welcome to the BS Report, a Monday afternoon here in Southern California. We're going to talk NBA today. The big Sloan Conference was in Boston last weekend. I had to miss it. First one I've missed, I think, in 6 years. We had some NBA shows, could not leave Magic and Jalen, but my heart was in Boston. A guy who was there the entire weekend, Zach Lowe from Grantland. What's happening?
I'm returning to normalcy after a weekend of nerding it out with the rest of the NBA.
It's great. There's so much more stuff to nerd out about than there was 5 years ago, too. It's gone to like 15 new levels. I mean, so I guess one of the big hits in the conference this year was Kirk Goldsberry did a thing about David Lee's defense. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, that was. I watched his presentation, of course, as a loyal Grantland fellow Grantland colleague, and he did more of his. He did a very interesting paper on trying to sort of quantify interior defense in a way that no one has really done before, using that fancy camera tracking data I've written about a bunch of times. It is in 15 NBA arenas. And he basically did some things like what do people shoot on close shots, like shots within the restricted area, when various, interior defenders are on the floor. So in other words, if a team shoots 60% from the restricted area normally, and they shoot, 48% when Dwight Howard is on the floor, that says something about Dwight Howard's defense. And he didn't just look at percentages, he looked at, how often a team shoots there. So like if Larry Sanders or Dwight Howard or whoever is in the game, they don't even get within 5 feet of the hoop because they're pulling up for floaters and just sort of living in fear of those big guys. And he did a couple of other things, trying to use that data, specific shot locations to measure that kind of thing. And David Lee, not surprisingly, did not come out well.
Right.
And Luis Scola was one of the other guys that was right there with him on, when David Lee is under the rim, teams are not afraid to shoot often and they shoot accurately. And when David Lee is even, and then he expanded it out, like, let's look at shots from anywhere on the floor when some of the, when some NBA big guys are closing out on the shot, when it's their guy shooting or it's their job to close out on a shot, whether it's 20 feet away or 2 feet away. Let's see what opponents shoot on those shots, what percentages they shoot. And David Lee did not fare well there either. And Kirk, as he has become a showman at these sorts of events, highlighted this with 3 video clips of David Lee playing very bad defense, and including one clip that he called the WTF rotation, which, in fairness to David Lee, was Golden State trying to play a zone, which Kirk did not highlight that it was a zone and not man-to-man. And Golden State zone, as I wrote about last week, has been just like a train wreck the entire season. But it drew raucous laughter. The Warriors representatives there were not, I would say they were not thrilled with Kirk's performance.
Oh, that's
and they took it good naturedly. It's not like they think David Lee's a stopper, but they thought perhaps he was a little bit unfairly singled out, but all in good fun.
So, yeah, I mean, a lot of this stuff also passes the eye test, and this is what I love about what's happening with basketball stats. In baseball, you just take the stats and that's it. You almost can't even have any other opinion than what the information tells you. In basketball, I think one of the fun things that's really happened is now we have all these great stats and all this data and all these numbers, but sometimes things don't make sense. A lot of times they do. You watch Warriors games and you think, yeah, David Lee is a bad defensive player. And now if we have a way to actually measure that and measure the effect that he has versus Larry Sanders, I think that's pretty interesting. And also, you think about like how people digest the NBA, and a lot of people still look at points and rebounds and whether a guy's scoring late in games, stuff like that. And we almost think of it like it's a fantasy basketball player, not a real basketball player. And I don't think people realize sometimes defense is 50% of whatever a guy's doing. This is what I thought the Tony Parker MVP campaign was so absurd. Like, yeah, he's having a tremendous offensive season, but defensively, LeBron versus Tony Parker is just no contest whatsoever. At what point do you think people are going to start to recognize the defensive impact of some of these guys?
Well, it's funny. If I sort of have like a mission statement as a writer, not to use a dramatic, term because we're writing about a freaking game, but I'm like obsessed with NBA defense. I mean, that's more than anything else why I write about the sport, because I don't think that we know a lot about NBA defense. And I don't think that a lot of fans sort of know how to evaluate it. It's very hard to learn what a team is supposed to be doing on defense. First of all, what rotations they're supposed to make and what they're not supposed to make, and how the systems differ, and who's really good at it. And, if you just did an interesting experiment to do is if you watch a game, let's say there are 15 dunks and basically wide open layups in that game. Go back and rewatch all 15 of those layups and dunks from start to finish in terms of the possession, and try and find out where the breakdown occurred that led to that layup or dunk. And what you'll often find is that it's something 4 or 5 steps before, and that if you're just watching the game in real speed and sort of are talking with your friends or tweeting or whatever, you're not going to notice that it's not the guy that you think is responsible for it. It's something else that happened where some guy cut in the wrong direction or got held up on a screen or something like that. And that stuff is really, really hard to quantify, but it's like the heart and soul of what happens on an NBA court. And it's half the game. I mean, you see people all the time, like, well, Kobe's averaging 29 on 50% shooting. He's having a fantastic year regardless of what you say about his defense. And you want to say, you can't relegate defense to the end of a sentence, as like a caveat after a whole spiel about something else. It's half the game. It's literally half the game. It's not an exaggeration.
And that's one of the reasons you and I like Marc Gasol so much. I just did this article about the best contract bargains. He's making like 14 or 15 million a year. I mean, it's only a couple million less than a max, but I thought he was the 5th or 6th best bargain in the entire league, just because who else does what he does? Like, we think Dwight Howard does what Gasol does defensively, but the reality is this year he hasn't been as good of a defensive player. Gasol, to me, is just by far the best defensive center. I don't even really know who else is like in his league.
Well, I think this year you have to talk about Joakim Noah as sort of.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, you're right.
To me, they're the co-defensive players of the year, and I think Tyson Chandler has gotten better as the year has gone on. And those are the guys that come to mind, right away. And if Larry Sanders played more minutes, I think that we would have to add his name to the conversation as well. But it's hard to be in that category when you play 25, 28 minutes, whatever his numbers are. But
you probably
you don't got to sell me on Marc Gasol. I'm fanboy number one.
You didn't see Memphis, Miami Friday night probably because you were at the Sloan Conference, but the way they defended LeBron was fascinating. I actually didn't even feel like LeBron had that bad of a game. He was playing really hard. They were doing all this stuff. It was a little reminiscent of what Dallas did in 2011 in the finals, trying to force him left. Ironically, what Michael Jordan talked about in that ESPN The Magazine piece by Red Thompson. Try to force him left. Always try to keep guys in front of him. It was a really interesting game to watch. It was ugly. It was disjointed. It's kind of how you have to beat that Miami team, and Gasol was at the center of it. I agree on Noah. I think Noah is on that level. I still like Gasol a little bit more just because he's a little more physically imposing. But Chandler, I don't know if he's been as dominant. I don't know what the stats say about this, but just eye test. I feel like he's 90% maybe where he was last year. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. He hasn't quite been as sort of airtight as he was last season. But I mean, part of that is just because he has so little to work with.
Yes.
with who he plays with, and that's something that's been exacerbated even this year because you had Kidd who can't really move around the court very well, although he's still very smart, and you have Melo playing a lot at the 4, where he's generally playing pretty hard on defense, and he can handle post-ups, but he can't rotate along the back line and protect the rim like a normal power forward. So, to me, he hasn't been as airtight, but there are some mitigating circumstances there.
On Friday night, Magic and Jalen and I were arguing about Rudy Gay, and it just kept escalating as in the green room the show went on. And it's interesting because in baseball it was cut and dry, and it became clear in the early 2000s that there was this old school dynamic and a new school dynamic, and the new school was going to win. And it took a while for some people to realize that, but it's just like math doesn't lie at a certain point. Basketball is a little different because you have five guys, and how they correlate to each other is a big part of whether a basketball team wins or loses. And some of the things that a basketball player does might not reflect well in the stats, but might reflect in the game in ways that the stats can't measure. Rudy Gay is a great example of this. If you talk about players like the guys who played, and even coaches and some GMs really value what he does. And they think he's like the prototypical small forward. He's 6'8", he can shoot, he can post up, he's a good defensive player. And yet none of the numbers back this up. And if you look at Rudy Gay's shooting stats the last 2 years, they're atrocious. And you look at the stats this year, I think he's shooting, I'm going to say 25% between 16 and 23 feet. And he's 30% from three-point shooting. Now, this is a 50-game sample size. At some point, the stats aren't lying. This guy just can't shoot anymore from, what he really is a low-post player, and he might even be a 4 at this point, not a 3. And yet there's this perception, oh, yeah, he's so talented. He's, this great small forward. Could he be the litmus test for this old school, new school thing?
It's going to be interesting. I mean, he's been shooting very badly this year, and these are the questions that make stats in basketball very interesting because, he's been shooting badly, and at least at the beginning of the trade, post-trade, Toronto was winning, and you sort of had to figure out, okay, why is that happening? And the easy argument to make was that, well, even though he's shooting badly, he's opening things up for DeMar DeRozan and the rest of the offense. So you say, okay, well, let's check the numbers on that. Oh, DeRozan is also shooting like crap, and Toronto's offense has actually not been that great since the trade. Okay, so what's going on after that? Okay, well, their defense has actually been a little bit better since the trade. This is mostly why they're winning, along with an easy schedule. Why has their defense been good? And then you see, what you'll actually see if you do this exercise is they're forcing a lot more turnovers since the trade, like an absurd amount of turnovers. And then you start thinking, okay, why is that happening? Let me look at the video. Let me look at the stats. And then you start to come up with an answer about what's actually going on in Toronto. And that's really how you have to use numbers and advanced stats. You have to use them to ask like 7 more questions than you originally started with. And you have to augment all of those questions with video because at the end of the day, the eye test is what's happening. And Rudy, well, we can talk more about Rudy, but that's really what's going on in Toronto. And look, he might be a litmus test for this or that, but if he shoots 40% and 30% from three, he's not a litmus test for anything. He's just not a good player.
Right. And Jalen makes an interesting. Jalen and Magic both made this point when we were hanging out in the green room, and they were arguing his case. They were saying that, let's say you're Miami and you're LeBron James. Whether or not Rudy Gay is having a good season is almost irrelevant. He's somebody you have to worry about because in the past he's done it. He brings a certain set of skills to the table. He's 6'8". He's somebody that, on paper, should be able to guard LeBron. So now LeBron goes into that game thinking, all right, I can't rest on defense. I have to worry about this guy a little bit. Even in the game, he's concentrating on where Rudy Gay is, stuff like that, versus just saying, I don't have to worry about who I'm playing. And their point was, Tayshaun Prince at this time of his career is a guy who's going to score between 7 and 10 points a game. And Jalen was saying, if I'm LeBron, I know I can just take defensive possessions off and save all of my energy for offense because this guy can't hurt me. Now, that's a pretty interesting point. Now, if Rudy Gay at least gives the perception that you have to worry about him, even if he's not shooting well, if his reputation affects the game, I don't know how we measure that, and that's where this stuff gets dicey.
Yeah, that's a real thing, and it's hard to measure, but you can measure it in simple things like who's guarding who. As teams wise up to the fact that Rudy Gay is sort of an inefficient player at times, they may start games like, well, let's see what happens if we guard him with, and Battier is even too good of an example because he's already an elite defender, but let's see what happens if we don't put our best defender on Rudy Gay, if our best defender is also our most important offensive player, and we want him to have a little bit of rest on defense. Let's just see if Rudy Gay can really punish us. And, that would be one way to measure it. Yeah, but that is a real thing. And, the flip side of that is look at, James Harden's defense has slipped to basically unacceptable levels in Houston because he has to carry such a big load on the other end of the floor. So that stuff is real, and it's important to watch how teams match up one-on-one in order to sort of adjust to that issue.
And I do think perceptions really affect what people thought they knew. They carry over into the present, and sometimes things just change. And the reality is, if you look at Rudy Gay's stats, and I was bored. We're watching all these games at once. I'm in our war room, and I'm just going through Hoop Data, all these sites, like trying to come up with more evidence to throw at these guys. And Rudy Gay's shooting has really slipped for whatever reason. And even if you look at where he's shooting on the court successfully, this year all of a sudden he's much more successful from 9 feet and in, which it confirms what I see when I'm watching these games. I feel like he's actually pretty good as a post-up player, especially if he's going against a small forward. It's a mismatch. And if I'm the other team, I want him shooting jumpers. I'm happy when he's shooting jumpers. And that was the way the Clippers defended him last year in the playoffs. They wanted to take out Zebo and Marc Gasol. They wanted Rudy Gay to beat them. And he had it. Remember how many dreadful games he had in that series? Like, he had a couple, like 6 for 22s and things like that. The shot location stats to me, and you've woven them into some of your columns. I think those are fascinating. I can't get enough of those. Like, you look at the Celtics, like where they shoot on 2-pointers between 16 and 23 feet. What are they, like 48%? Like, they're by far the best 2-point shooting team from deep. And, that confirms what I'm watching. This is how this team lives and dies by jump shots. What's your favorite shot location stuff?
Well, my favorite shot location stuff. Well, I love to you got to monitor the corner threes on both ends of the floor. Who's good at getting them? Who's bad at giving them up? But I sort of like that. I like how the league, and this gets at the evolution and the sort of the smart stuff you're talking about. I like how the league has realized that like 5 to 9 feet is actually a really bad shot in a lot of in a lot of situations, and that goes to something like the Knicks deciding we're just going to go all in with Melo at power forward, even though he's going to be overmatched size-wise on a lot of nights. We can send help in creative ways, and we actually don't care if, like, Carlos Boozer can back him down a couple of dribbles and get off an 8-foot jump hook, because that looks really tantalizing, and our perception of it is that it's a really good shot, and that's where our perception is wrong. It's a really bad shot, and that's why you have guys like George Karl will say, one of the reasons we switch a lot on defense is because we don't care if, like, a small forward with limited post-up skills or Brandon Bass with limited post-up skills has an advantage 8 feet from the hoop. We just don't think it's a big deal. We think it's a low percentage shot. And that's sort of one of those things where the perception is beginning to tilt in ways that guide how teams play defense and who guards who and stuff like that.
It's funny, like, I remember when Perkins was on the Celtics, and a couple times teams would guard Perkins with much smaller guys. And they're basically daring the Celtics to post up Perkins, right? And if you're a Celtic fan, you're thinking, oh, God, please don't post up Perkins. Almost like they're playing a Jedi mind trick on the Celtics. No, post him up. Go ahead. We're going to guard him with a 6'5" guy. And it would always be a disaster. And I think it's funny sometimes when teams do this. I feel like teams do this with, when I watch the Clippers, they're begging Lamar Odom to shoot jump shots.
Well, right? They should be. He's a bad shooter.
They're leaving him open, and he's thinking to himself, I'm Lamar Odom. I was on the 2009-2010 champion Los Angeles Lakers. You can't leave me open. But the reality is you can, because at this point in his career, if he's the guy deciding games for you, that's a position you want to be in. And a lot of teams have figured that out. One thing we should talk about, which I love, which I really haven't even started looking at until the last maybe 15 months, are the 5-man unit stats. In my opinion, these are the best basketball stats that are out there, because it's just cut and dry. And you could say there's a little bit of a variable, maybe, a second team going against other second teams can skew it a little bit. But one of the stats I wrote about in Friday's column was Indiana's, it's George Hill, Stevenson, Paul George, Roy Hibbert, David West, which have played the lion's share of minutes for them.
Destroys the league.
It's been awesome. And if you're making the case for the Pacers as a real sleeper in the East, look at that crunch time lineup. That's a lineup that it outscores by 100 possessions. What is it, like they're plus 15 points?
Yeah, they're up around 13, I think, something like that.
Yeah, and at that point, that's not lying. They've played almost 900 minutes together, and they've destroyed everybody. And if I'm Miami, I look at that lineup and go, uh-oh, because you got Lance Stevenson for Wade, and you have Paul George for LeBron, and Hibbert in the middle, and at least they're going to make Miami work a little bit. When you just judging that stat and what you've seen in their defensive stats and stuff, are we sleeping on Indiana?
I don't think anyone is really sleeping on Indiana, honestly. I think that the proper way to evaluate Indiana is they're the second best team in the Eastern Conference. That's probably their ceiling. They have the ability more than probably any team, considering that the Knicks have been shaky for the last 20, 30 games. They have the ability to be like a frisky Miami opponent because of their size and especially because of their defense. But just their offense has gotten better. I think they're about league average over their last 20 games, which is what Frank Vogel's goal basically was when I talked to him a month or so ago. But,
yep.
It's just going to be hard to beat. It's going to be hard for them to beat Miami 4-7 because you could do the same exercise you just did with 5-man units for Miami. And you'll realize that, we were sitting here fretting about Miami's early season defense and all these problems. Then you look at the lineup data. When the 4 or 5 lineups that are actually going to play for Miami when it matters, when they're on the floor, they're kicking ass just as much, if not more, than Indiana. So, I don't think we're sleeping on Indiana. I think if you say they're probably the second best team, the team most likely to push Miami to 6 or even 7 games if they get lucky, that's who they are.
I don't think NBA nerd circles, which I think we both belong to, are sleeping on Indiana. I think the general public probably doesn't realize that a Miami-Indiana series on paper might not be sexy and might not, maybe ESPN will be TNT will be a little disappointed in it, but I think that's a great series. And, this Indiana team, a couple things are happening. Paul George, you wrote about them last month, and that was the first big thing I'd read about their defense and how their defense was so much better than people realized. And even you could justify the Hibbert contract, even though he's been bad offensively, by how good their defense has been. But Paul George has ascended, and it's been in a couple different bumps. But I think the All-Star game really helped him. And I have no evidence other than the eye test, but he belonged in that game, and he had some big moments, and he actually kind of kept the East alive in the fourth quarter. And I hate overrating the All-Star game, but I think it can be important sometimes, especially if you're Paul George, you're playing really well, you're not totally sure if you belong, and then you go in a game like that with all these stars and you play well, and he looks like he has another level of confidence now. And then you have West and Hill, Stevenson, these tough guys who aren't going to be afraid of Miami. They're not going to roll over. I think Miami's going to have to work to win that series. I think they will, but it'll be a good series, right? I think we should be excited for that series if that's the Eastern Finals.
I do think someone is going to give Miami a tough series, and there's a huge distance between giving Miami a tough series and beating Miami 4 times in 7 games. But I do think someone in the Eastern Conference will push them. And right now, looking at the last 20, 30 games we have, looking at how they played them pretty tough in the playoffs last year, although Bosch missed most of that series, Indiana is probably the likeliest candidate to do that. And yeah, look, you're right about Paul George. I mean, I don't particularly care about the All-Star game, but he's been playing very, very well. George Hill has quietly had a really, really good season. No one has noticed it. Or only the NBA nerds have noticed it. He's been good. And David West, this is really an irrelevant debate when it comes down to it, but I still think David West is the best player on that team over Paul George. But it's very close, and he's just been a rock. And Hibbert is a star in Kurt Goldsberry's in his study at Sloan about interior defense. Hibbert killed everyone but Larry Sanders and Dwight. So yeah, they're going to be tough. And you're right that it's tough for me to pull back out of the NBA nerd world and think about what the general sports fan thinks. But you're right, the general fan at large probably doesn't realize how good Indiana is.
And West is a really, really good end of the game guy, and all the stats back that up. But just a ton of confidence, tough matchup. He can score in a variety of ways. It's hard to watch that and not think about the fact that the Celtics thought they had him. Remember? 2 summers ago.
That almost came up in conversation with Mike Zarin, their assistant GM at Sloan, and for some reason I got sidetracked. But David West came up, and it sparked in my mind that there was like a second where David Aldridge, I think, reported the Celtics were close to a deal with him, and you just think, well, that could have been interesting.
Yeah, because he absolutely an upgrade over Brandon Bass, and then they also would have had him this year. Then maybe they don't re-sign Brandon Bass, or they wouldn't have had Brandon Bass to even re-sign. I think they just would have let Davis go. But really good signing by them. I think it was 2 years, $10 million a year, something like that, and he's outplayed that contract. I was watching the Knicks yesterday. They're 16 and 15 in their last 31 games. 3-point shooting, which we knew was a little bit of fool's gold for them. In the month of November, I think they were like 41% in November, making like 12 a game. That went south. Felton has gone off the cliff. I don't know what happened to him. I don't think people realize that the Knicks are a 500 team right now, and I'm not sure if that gets better. What do you think?
It's funny. I'm not worried about the Knicks. 16 and 15 is not worrisome to me, only because if you put it together with whatever they were, 18 and 5 or whatever the heck the record was after 25 games, it sort of you can't. It's no more or less important than that start. In other words, the truth for the Knicks is somewhere probably in between those extremes, and that's a pretty good truth. And you're right that the 3-point shooting has regressed, but regression for them has been like league average, so that they're shooting, I think, like 38% now. That's great. That's top 5. That's more than enough to justify the threes that they're taking. But their depth has sort of sprung some leaks. The Ronnie Brewer thing is weird to me that they just sort of gave up on him, considering that James Flight White is now starting.
It's crazy.
And Amare, I think I actually like the way that Woodson has handled Demare's reintegration and how he's sort of made subtle adjustments every couple of weeks or so as he sees what works and what doesn't. But I don't trust him, on the floor in crunch time of a close game, and Woodson doesn't appear to either. So that's also going to be an issue.
I think they're strangely coached, and Woodson has gotten a lot of slack this year because people like him. And you watch that team, the fact that I don't know what happened with Brewer or why they just decided. I know he was in a shooting funk, but instead of riding it out, they just buried him and he was never seen again. And then it should be a bad sign when Oklahoma City is immediately trying to trade for him. Like, that should be a red flag. Like, oh, wait a second, what's going on here? Why are they trying to trade for him? Because you never want to trade to the smart teams. But, a little bit of fool's gold with Rasheed Wallace, who hadn't played in 3 years and wasn't in great shape the last couple of years when he did play. They rolled the dice with a lot of old guys. Kid went off a cliff. Yesterday was the first good game he'd had in a while. You watch them play, and like we were watching yesterday in the war room, like, why is Carmelo and J.R. Smith bringing the ball up when you have Felton and Jason Kidd on the floor with them? It's just these weird things they're doing that they don't totally make sense. Like, Carmelo's handling the ball way more than he should. It's almost like they're trying to de-emphasize Ray Felton because he's been playing badly, but they're not going to go anywhere unless he starts playing better. I just don't really understand what they're doing. I don't understand why you start James White for 5 minutes and then don't play him again. Like, what's the purpose of that?
Well, that's not going to last. They'll ditch that eventually. That's just sort of a mid-season.
Why even do it, though?
What the hell? Well, I think Kidd's slump was a concern to them, and they talked about, we want to make him the backup point guard and bring him off the bench, see how that works, if that sort of gets him out of his funk. But the danger of that is, Kidd's not really a point guard anymore. He sort of plays a position that he invented, of like some sort of weird hybrid of all the perimeter positions, and he doesn't get into the lane, and so that means that J.R. Smith essentially becomes your backup point guard. And it's nice when J.R. Smith is like a secondary ball handler. It's not nice all the time when he's like a primary ball handler that has to run a ton of pick and rolls. Yeah,
this is why I don't believe in the Knicks. And I said on TV, I really thought that was a bad loss for them yesterday because everything was lined up for them. They had a big lead at halftime, and they just rolled over and got annihilated in the second half on national TV at home. It just was not a good loss. And it's always funny, like, I check my Twitter replies, which I try not to do that often, but people are like, screw you. You hate the Knicks. It's like, I don't hate anybody. All I can do is say what I'm watching. And what I'm watching is a really disjointed team that doesn't really know who their best five guys are. They haven't totally figured out how to play Amari, Chandler, and Carmelo at the same time. And at the end of games, they have Carmelo and J.R. Smith running the offense. That doesn't make sense to me, especially when you have Kidd, Prigioni, and Felton. Why would you run anything through J.R. Smith? What's the point of that? I'm just confused.
Doesn't bother me as much as it bothers you. I actually sort of like Melo handling the ball a lot. He's been a pretty good pick and roll player. He's a better passer, and it's nice to mix it up and put Felton off the ball, even though his shooting has fallen off a cliff. I'm not worried about the Knicks. I think that they're a very good team, somewhere between the hot start and the sort of cold, mediocre middle 30 games. And I actually think, in terms of their night-to-night variance, I think they have the sort of highest ceiling of the sub-Miami group in the Eastern Conference. In other words, when they play really well, they're the best of that Indiana, Chicago, New York. I don't even want to throw in Brooklyn, but Brooklyn if you want, group. But yeah, I mean, they have issues, and Shumpert hasn't done what they had hoped. And I think that they hope that Shumpert might be part of their crunch time five and decrease their burden on J.R. Smith a little bit, but that hasn't happened.
They need him to get better. I disagree with you in this respect. I think the last 31 games do mean something. I think, and I feel the same way about the Warriors. Like every year you're going to have a rabbit team in each conference that's going to play well and things are going to come together, and then the league is just going to watch them and figure out how to beat them. And with the Warriors, you knew their defense eventually was going to come back to start biting them. You chronicled last week. You did a good piece about just how bad their defense has gotten. But
the Warriors had a lot of people at Sloan, and they were not mad about that piece, which says I think a lot about what they think about their own defense right now.
Yeah, it's not good. And I've been saying this for the last couple weeks. I thought that was the team that could fall out. When you're talking about who are the Lakers going to leapfrog, I just didn't think it was going to be Houston because I like the way Houston's playing. I think it's just too easy for them to score and get hot and outscore teams some nights that I can't imagine them not getting to 45 wins. Utah, because they didn't make any trades, they'd have to have some injuries probably to fall out. But Golden State was the team I kept coming back to because you think the Bogut thing's not working out. Defensively, they've really fallen off a cliff. Klay Thompson has been in a massive slump, and he really only had one hot month this year. Other than that, he's a 39% shooter. And, they haven't even had I hate to say it, but, they're getting a full season out of Stephen Curry, which is somewhat of a rarity. And if he got hurt, this whole thing collapses. So do you agree that could be the team that falls out here?
I would, except 16 of their last 23 at home is just huge. And but they're clearly playing by far the worst out of any of those teams, and their defense is not just bad; it's like Sacramento Kings bad. So if you play, no matter how many home games you have, if you play Sacramento Kings defense, you're going to be lucky to win half of your home games. So they do have to play better, but I think that home safety net is just huge for them going down the stretch.
We'll see, because if you're not playing well, at some point it just doesn't matter where you're playing. It does sit that crowd definitely helped them on that Friday night game against the Spurs. There's no question. But, the Lakers, they won a huge game last night against the Hawks. That was Kobe reached back to 1999, 2000 with one of the dunks he had over Josh Smith. But the Lakers are not going away. And if they can stay healthy, they're going to get in. And it's just a question for me of who falls out. I don't think it's going to be Houston, which leaves Utah or Golden State. I guess Utah could potentially
Utah is the team I'm watching. And I'm a little less bullish on the Lakers as like a sure thing playoff team than you are. But yes, it was a very exciting game last night. And Kobe, although it took every shot in the last 2 minutes of the game, he did make a couple of them that were very important.
I was more bullish after I watched the game 2 Fridays ago when the Lakers shot 3 times as many free throws as Portland. I was like, oh, okay. I forgot about this variable. The Lakers get every call variable. That could be
I did. That was a fun. You know what was fun about that game? I didn't watch that game. That wasn't one of the games I had picked for that night.
Yeah.
Then I was reading the blog recaps, and even like the Blazers blog was, of course, going crazy about the refs, and the Lakers blogs were even saying, the refs do. It seemed like we did get every call. NBA.com's video recap, those like 3-minute clips that did refs just not mentioned, free throws not mentioned, just like, not. Look at these exciting highlights.
Antoine Jamison shot half as many free throws as the entire Portland team. I think he shot more free throws in that game than he probably did all season combined. What else are you looking for these last 5 weeks before we go? Any subplot you're monitoring that you think could affect the race?
I think the race for number 7 in the Eastern Conference is interesting. The Bucks are to the point now where a playoff spot is basically wrapped up, and now they're looking at the Celtics and maybe if Brooklyn slumps or Atlanta slumps, another team in that race. But I think Milwaukee has its sights set on, we want to avoid Miami, and we think we can get there. And that's interesting. And then you got, will Bynum play this season? It almost certainly looks like he won't. And then you just, all the lottery teams, this is what I'm writing about for tomorrow, all the teams whose seasons are basically over, everyone's going to stop paying attention to them now unless they're playing an important game for somebody else. But, every one of those lottery teams has some things that they want to see that might be signs for growth next season. And one in particular is the Wolves, simply because they've got, if Kevin Love comes back, and he's going to, they've got like precious little time now to see how Love, Karolinko, Rubio, Pekovic fits together before Pekovic hits unrestricted free agency and gets a huge contract, and Karolinko probably opts out of his deal for next year and becomes a free agent. And then the Wolves all of a sudden have a very big decision to make, 2 very big decisions to make.
I think I'm glad you brought them up, because as you were saying, the one team I was like, I hope he says the Wolves. There's a lot of Kevin Love buzz going around right now about whether he stays or not. And the Pekovic thing, is he unrestricted?
Pekovic is unrestricted.
He's not restricted?
Not restricted. He was,
wow.
I believe he's a second-round pick, and he's already signed one contract, so he's now unrestricted.
Oh, my God. That's a huge monkey wrench for this summer. I thought he was restricted.
Yeah, I was floating his name around the Sloan Conference, sort of seeing what people thought he would get. And the figure I started with was, I said, well, he's clearly a $10 million player, right? And universally, the reaction from people all across the league, Wolves, non-Wolves, everyone, was, he's going to get way more than that.
Yeah, I was going to say
12, 13, maybe more.
So the rule on this is whatever your instinct is for what the right price for him, for any free agent is, then add 40% to that price. So $10 million seems totally legitimate and fine, but that means he's going to get $14 million.
He may well. I mean, seriously, he may well. And that's when you're the Wolves, you got to start asking yourself, is he worth that? Can we sign and trade him? Can we sign and trade him for anything useful? Because if we don't get anything useful, Kevin Love is 2 years away from the end of his contract, and we're like a borderline playoff team at best again with no center, or with Greg Stiemsma. So that's he's a very interesting free agent to watch.
Atlanta, which might be one of the smart teams. I think Atlanta is a possibility for him. I think Utah is a possibility for him. And there's teams with cap space. Unfortunately, there's not free agents. So somebody like him, and Brandon Jennings, who's going to get overpaid. And I think that one's going to work out a lot worse than the Pekovic signing. But that part's going to be fun. Also with Minnesota, this is a team people are picking for the playoffs. And for a variety of reasons, they just look hopeless. They played the Lakers Friday night. There was just no chance. I'm also a little worried about Rubio now because maybe they just shouldn't have brought him back. I'm not sure.
From his injury for this season, you mean?
Yeah, was it worth it to bring him back? Was it worth it to rush him back in 12 months so that he could play for a lottery team? Maybe they were just better off doing what Chicago's doing with Derrick Rose. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know if they rushed him back because Shumpert's already back from an injury that he suffered later in the calendar last year than Rubio. And Rubio's been playing well lately. He's averaging like 9-10 assists a game in his last probably 10 games.
I noticed
he
that.
looks fit and a little bit bouncy again. Obviously, still can't shoot. But to me, there is value for them in saying, even if we just get 15 games with all these pieces, we got to see how those pieces fit. At least we got to get like an elementary idea of how they fit. There's value in that.
Okay, so if that's true, then you must disagree with how Chicago's handling Derrick Rose.
Well, look, I'm hesitant to weigh into. I don't know what his knee is like. We just see these clips, we see these highlights, and I don't know how he feels. Everyone's body is different. It's injuries and medical stuff is like the last sort of secret frontier in the NBA, and even trainers will tell you what we don't know, outweighs what we know. So it is interesting that we're getting close. We're not far from the end of the season, and there's very little buzz on he's going to be back soon. He's going to be back soon, and it is interesting. But it's like Royce White. I'm just not going there until I get unless I can look at the medical files.
Yeah, the Royce White story, impossible to comment on.
You're going to look like a jerk one way or the other, and really, you're just no one. There are like 10 people in the world who are informed enough to make a really serious, really sort of declarative who's right, who's wrong statement on an issue like that. It's just very hard to do.
Yeah. Zach Lowe, as always, a pleasure. We should mention that you taped a bunch of podcasts for us at the Sloan Conference that are running on our YouTube channel and on the Grantland network, our brother network, on iTunes. So check those out. Who were the three that you did?
We did Daryl Morey, who was really good and told some funny stories about Chandler Parsons, and we did Brian Kopp, who's sort of the guru at stats of those fancy tracking cameras about the future of those and what they're learning from them. And a really interesting one we did with Ben Alomar, who nobody knows really outside the NBA nerd circle, but he was the analytics guy for the Thunder until this year, and he told some interesting stories about how they approached drafting Russell Westbrook, how they almost picked Brook Lopez over him, and why the numbers sort of pointed to Westbrook and that kind of stuff. So some good stuff in there.
I look forward to listening to them. And I think we're going to call Daryl right now just to get his recap of the Sloan Conference. We will check you out on Grantland this week. Thanks as always.
Always a pleasure, sir.
I'm glad we got through this without talking Celtics. I think America was happy.
I think America, and the Celtics get a little too much publicity for a 7-seed playoff roadkill right now. But let's see what they do in the last 20 games.
They're not far away from the 5-seed. They're like a game and a half back. Don't think I haven't looked. I like the Celtics team.
We've all looked. We'll see what they do.
I like the Celtics team. All right, we'll talk to you soon.
See ya, man.
We were supposed to have Daryl Morey as second guest, but he went MIA. I guess he's working on a trade or something. We will call him later in the week on the BS Report. We're going to publish this one, and we'll be back tomorrow with a new, fresh, tasty one. Until then.
So I get to sign off. Whoa!
Thank you for downloading the BS Report with Bill Simmons.
Too much fun.
Check out more podcasts at the iTunes Music Store or at PodCenter at ESPNRadio.com.
Peace out.